State of Western Australia, Part 1. Salinity, the Western Swamp Tortoise, rivers, wetlands and waterways, the numbat, endangered plants, the Western Quoll. If we don't protect our environment, we'll lose it forever. We can protect it by understanding it. When we think of salt, most of us probably imagine the stuff we put on some foods or the salty ocean we swim in. But to many Western Australian farmers, salinity is a form of land sickness because it can turn green pastures into degraded wasteland.
Salinity is essentially too much salt in the root zone of plants and too much salt in the root zone of crops and pastures. It's caused by clearing and it's induced by having shallow water tables that rise up and get into the roots of the plants. There's two types of salinity. There's salinity that occurs in the wheat belt in terms of salt lakes and chains of old riverbeds that occurred naturally, and that salinity is known as primary salinity. The sort of salinity that we talk about in the wheat belt that's affecting crops and pastures and native vegetation is known as secondary or dryland salinity.
WA has over 70% of Australia's dryland salinity. It's one of the most critical environmental problems facing our state. It affects around 9% of the wheat belt.
In 1996, when the last estimates were done using the old techniques, there was around about 1.8 million hectares of farmland that was too salty to grow crops or pastures, or that was too salty to produce a full yield. So something like a greater than 50% yield reduction had occurred.
Scientists are concerned that figure of 1.8 million could double by the year 2020. Soon they'll have new satellite maps showing land from Geraldton to Esperance affected by salinity. But it's not just the damage you can see that's a problem. While the barren wasteland is an obvious sign of salt trouble, other salinity destruction is far more secretive.
For example, things like some towns that have the brickwork is fretting away and the town is, if you like, rotting from the ground up. They're the more subtle. Perhaps bumps in roads that you don't remember from last year where the water table is a little shallower.
The big loss of land is adding up for farmers who are losing about $64 million in production in WA per year due to salt. The main cause of salinity is overclearing of native vegetation. 18.5 million hectares of bushland have been cleared in WA since 1826.
About 1 cupful of water per square metre used to go under the forest and woodlands of the wheat belt every year. So a cupful every square metre. Nowadays, after clearing, around about 20 litres or a good couple of buckets of water go underground every square metre every year. So that's a huge difference.
And all the salt has to go somewhere, leaching out through creeks and waterways.
And in rivers like the Blackwood, when you add all that up, it means that rivers like the Blackwood have currently got a salt load of between 1 and 2 million tonnes per year, which is a big semi-trailer and truckload every 10 or 15 minutes going out of Augusta, which is a lot of salt.
Okay, so this is called ripping. So this area has been ripped so that these plants this saltbush can be planted. I think this area has been like this for at least about 60 or 70 years. But so it might have been rabbits. Rabbits are very bad for soil erosion. They, with their rabbit holes that they dig those, and see how thick it is? That was the surface of the lake. Walked out over across the top of that.
In Tamman, around 20 schools a year visit a special land care education centre to learn about environmental issues, including salinity. Students can stay up to 4 nights, and when they leave, it's hoped they'll take with them ideas on how to fix land problems.
Woodlands Primary School and Woodlapine Primary School, they have a look at things on either a local level, and Woodlapine, for example, has adopted an area of bushland right next to their school, and they've worked at rehabilitating that area, planting trees, putting in pathways, and generally improving the quality of the bushland that's next to them. Woodlands Primary School, they grow seedlings that they take out to Tamman to plant on some of the farms out at Tamman area.
But planting trees is seen as a long-term solution to dealing with salinity because many plantations take up to 20 years to mature. Scientists from Agriculture WA say there are other things we can do.
If we can't turn the recharge tap off or significantly slow it down. The other option we have is to increase the amount of water coming out of the ground, and to do that I'm talking about things like drains and pumps.
Despite the destruction salinity causes, there is some good news. There are now salt-tolerant plants which can be grown on the salt land and can be used as crops for sheep and cattle. And aquaculture, or growing fish in the salty regions, is also a new industry.
You can actually make energy out of salty water. You build a pond. The water at the bottom of the pond traps all the energy coming in from the sun. It gets to about 80 degrees Celsius, so which is very hot, and the water at the top of the pond is the same as the day temperature, and you can produce an electrical current between those two temperatures of water. There's also new technology that enables us to take some of the salts out of the water. So we all know that the salt that's causing the salinity in the wheat belts, principally sodium and chloride. That's what we put on our fish and chips, if you like. But amongst the rest of the 20% of the other salts are magnesiums, which make mag wheels for cars. There are bromide, there is calcium and magnesium, there are sulphur, and there are a range of compounds that you can produce, evaporate, and by a range of chemical processes, make even things like fire-resistant plasterboard.
While all that sounds as if salty water can be put to good use, remember the effects of salinity are devastating. It has ruined big areas of farmland in our state. In fact, every month, WA loses an area the size of Rottnest Island to salt. That's land that can no longer be used. What do this little tortoise and this man have in common? They were both rescued by the same person. The western swamp tortoise is Australia's most endangered reptile, the rarest tortoise on Earth. There are less than 200 like him in the world. Until 1953, this little short-necked creature was thought to be extinct. But that's when Perth boy Raiden Gates from Upper Swan found one crossing the road about 30 kilometres northeast of the city. He's just a tiny little thing, but his little legs have taken a giant step back from being wiped out.
Well, they had a very small natural range, which was largely confined to the Swan Valley, which was the first part of Western Australia that was cleared for agriculture. So their habitat was under threat very early. When they were rediscovered in the 1950s, the government organised for 2 nature reserves to be created for their protection in the Upper Swan and Walbrook areas. But when scientific research started to look at what was going on in the reserves, it was found that the numbers were going down there and not up. And one of the major causes for that was the introduced red fox. And so both nature reserves have now had fox-proof fences put around them.
By the late 1980s, there were less than 50 of these tiny tortoises in existence. Since then, millions of dollars from public and private donations have poured in to help save the Swampy, as he's affectionately known. These creatures are only active in water, swimming and feeding on small aquatic invertebrates. When swamps dry up, they head underground into estivation holes for a kind of a summer sleep that can last 6 to 7 months. Surprisingly, they only lose 5 to 10% of their body mass. Land clearing, development and red foxes have taken a heavy toll on the western swamp tortoise. His swimming spots have been drained and filled. He's been pushed out of his home to make way for our houses, while foxes and ravens have him for dinner. In 1988, Dr. Gerard Kutschling from the University of Western Australia started Perth Zoo's captive breeding program. The first major step was to get females to reproduce. Ultrasound was used. Special enclosures and diet were designed, and finally the females laid 12 eggs. Unfortunately, only 5 survived. Within 2 years, that rate had improved, and today around 170 tortoises are being bred at Perth Zoo. Rearing hatchlings may take as long as 10 to 15 years, but in the wild they can struggle to survive their first few months.
If hatchlings do not grow, I think it's over 18 grams, during the first growing season, we never see them again. So obviously they disappear and do not survive the summer.
The western swamp tortoise is unique. It's the only tortoise in the world to dig a hole using front legs.
Females only lay 1 clutch of eggs per year. They dig the nest hole with the front legs. So they dig a hole in the soil, head first, about 10 to 12 centimeters deep. And then the female turns around and lays between 2 and 6 eggs.
At the zoo, the eggs are collected and kept in incubators for up to 180 days, controlled at either 24 or 29 degrees. And how's this for a diet? Mosquito larvae, brine shrimp and black worms. That's all the hatchlings are fed for the first year. Adults are treated to Western swamp tortoise pudding, a blend of minced rats, ox heart, fish, marron and vitamin powder with some gelatin.
One major aspect for the long-term survival of this population here is really to acquire some additional areas where habitat can be restored.
Community and conservation agencies have cooperated in this case to make sure Swampy, while still endangered, will survive.
West Australians love water, but while we use it, we also abuse it. From transport, irrigation, recreation and industry to accidental chemical and sewage spills. Just imagine jumping into a swimming pool full of the stuff we usually flush down the toilet. Yuck! On top of that, add toxic chemicals, pesticides, oil, petrol and weeds. You wouldn't do it, but that's just what we're forcing wetland wildlife and plants to do.
Thick waterways classically show signs of they have a lot of algal blooms. They tend to get problems with midges. That tends to occur in wetlands. In river systems, again, tend to get a lot of algal blooms. Often we'll put up signage to say that people can't swim in those systems because the algae might be toxic to people that might want to swim in the system. Other signs of sick wetlands or waterways will be dead or dying vegetation on the foreshore or in the buffer zones around the wetlands. Lots of weeds is a sign of a sick system.
Healthy waterways look good, surrounded by lots of native plants and animals. One of the worst ways we can destroy them is with nutrients, like phosphorus and nitrogen.
Because it comes from all sorts of directions in the catchment. We can get spills associated with sewage spills, but also from our own activity, living in our houses, watering, fertilising our lawn or washing our cars on our lawns. Those nutrients find their ways into the drainage system, and that finds its way into our waterways and our wetlands and ultimately starts to cause algal blooms.
Water going into a wetland can come from all over. That's called the catchment area. At Bannister Creek, its catchment stretches from the Kent Street Weir under Canning Vale's industrial area to Jandakot and Linwood. The local catchment group plays a vital role cleaning up this once very polluted trouble spot.
Our main role is to coordinate all the environmental type activities to do with the catchment and the creek itself.
Without volunteers like Maury and Dawn, Bannister Creek would be a lot sicker than it is today. Over 2 years, they've spent nearly 4,000 hours weeding and cleaning up this waterway. The Bannister Creek Catchment Group also relies on school power, an army of local students who help monitor water quality and recently solved an expensive and dangerous rusty fence problem.
They came up with about 9 designs to cover these safely, and we've ended up adopting 2 of those designs. One is a 40mm PVC pipe and the other is a recycled solution made from a canister from people who use silicon tube. We have a glazier in the area who gives us all our tubes and they're put on the top.
There are dozens of things students can do to help save our wetlands.
Become part of our Ribbons of Blue program and be involved in monitoring our waterways and keeping a watch on what's happening to them in terms of nutrients and in terms of other chemical indicators of problems in our waterways.
And we would like to actually give them a site that is their very own site. They do the planning for it, they do the planting of any plants. We don't expect them to become weeders.
The Water and Rivers Commission is like the official police of our waterways, investigating and identifying who is polluting and where. But they need help. Remember, saving our waterways starts at home by using garden chemicals and pesticides carefully, never tipping paint oil or chemicals down the drain and never dumping garden weeds around wetlands, where they'll grow and choke native vegetation. At Linwood Primary, students hope their study, to find out how healthy Bannister Creek is, will help keep it safe now and for the future.
By doing this in 1999, we can use it as a benchmark and monitor it over the next 6 or 7 years to see whether the work that's being done by the community and the school has making any improvement.
The numbat. He's Western Australia's mammal emblem. But foxes and feral cats have no respect when they're hungry. They've feasted on this endangered animal. They've pushed him to the brink of extinction.
The very distinct stripes on the back, on the lower back, and then this stripe through the eye and along the side of the face. They're one of the most beautifully marked Australian animals.
He goes by a few names, from numbat to banded anteater or walpurti, and now survives in just a few small pockets of WA's southwest. A successful fox baiting campaign, codenamed Operation Foxglove, has given this little marsupial new hope. The scheme is part of the Department of Conservation's multi-million-dollar Western Shield program. It's the biggest fauna rescue operation ever undertaken in the world. Its aim is simple: to kill off feral predators to save native animals and return them to the wild.
Before the program started in about 1979, I estimate the numbers of numbats were about 300 animals only. And now we're well over 1,000, probably more like 1,300 numbats.
The numbat has been dubbed the exterminator because all he eats is termites, up to 20,000 of them a day. That's about 10% of his body weight. The best place to catch a glimpse of this little character in the wild is Dryandra woodland near Narrogin and Perup forest near Manjimup. Perth Zoo runs a vital and successful captive breeding program.
The reintroduction program has been successful. We've been moving animals from the wild into new situations, as well as from captive breeding colonies into new situations. And we've now established 9 new populations of numbats. When the program started, there were only 2 populations.
Male numbats roam far and wide in their search for a mate. Between January and March, 4 young are usually born and stay attached to teats until they develop fur. When weaned, they're placed in a small cubby-like chamber underground, and that's where they stay while mum goes out to hunt termites. Like most youngsters, they're active and like to play when they're left alone. They leave home about a year after birth. Numbats have nifty safety mechanisms. If an enemy threatens, they can use their extremely thick-skinned rump to plug the hollow or logs they shelter in. This endangered creature faces many hurdles, from land clearing and bushfires which wipe out his habitat, to the numerous predators that hunt him.
Everything from wedge-tailed eagles down to quite small sparrowhawks. Snakes as well, particularly carpet pythons, will take numbats quite readily. Small numbats can even be taken by large monitors, the bung arrow or racehorse goanna.
If conservationists hadn't stepped in to save numbats in the 1980s and breed them back from the brink of extinction, no one in the world would have seen a live numbat again. The species would have been lost forever.
It would have been very embarrassing if WA's state mammal emblem had gone extinct. And that's probably caused a lot of support from the community as well as from the government. But the numbat's a very beautiful animal as well. It's very distinctive, and I think that also helped.
Scientists are now confident our furry little friend will survive. In Western Australia, we're lucky to have some of the most spectacular and richest regions of wildflowers in the world. But over the years, land clearing, salinity, weeds and animal grazing have destroyed many of the plants' homes and all but wiped out the white feather flower.
Well, there are only 3 populations known. 2 of them are on very narrow road reserves and the 3rd one on private property. Despite extensive surveys, it's never been found anywhere else. And this is quite amazing because there are very large areas of uncleared bushland in nature reserves and national parks quite nearby. And so it's quite possible they are lurking, it is lurking somewhere elsewhere. And I think with more searches over the next 5 or 10 years, we may find some more. At least we hope so.
Another plant under threat is the sandplain duck orchid. It's one of only 7 duck orchids in WA, and none of those are found anywhere else in the world.
All of the duck orchids have an amazing pollination biology. They actually have a lip that looks very much like a female insect, and they give off a thing called a pheromone. It's a chemical attractant that attracts a male wasp. When the male wasp tries to copulate with the lip of the flower, it flicks over and traps the wasp inside a cup formed by the lobes of the column. And the wasp doesn't die there, it's just trapped for maybe a few seconds, but in the process it either removes or deposits pollen. So it's quite an amazing thing.
Both of these plants, and nearly 350 more in our state, are threatened and need special protection. Everyone can play a role in helping this flora survive.
Well, Cohen's put out a publication called Western Australia's Threatened Flora, and there are photographs in that of all of our threatened plants. If they get a copy of that, they could hopefully find some of them, and that's already happened. Members of the public have found some of those rare plants elsewhere. They can get involved with recovery teams that have been set up around Western Australia and perhaps help with surveys and that sort of thing on a voluntary basis.
Photos of the rare plants you find can be emailed to the Department of Conservation and Land Management or sent by post. Western Australians are very lucky to be able to see one of these little creatures, a chuditch, close up.
The animal itself gets up to about half the size of a domestic cat. It's a carnivore. It's covered with up to 60 spots on its body, so it's a very attractive animal. It's similar to the other quolls or native cats that we have in Australia. There are 3 other species of that. This animal, the western quoll, did go out into the desert, and it was last known from those areas in the 1940s. Aboriginal people have a lot of stories about western quoll, and it's a very important totemic animal to the desert Aboriginal people. But it, as I mentioned earlier, it only occurs now in the wetter southwest of Western Australia, but it's obviously got able to adapt to a wide range of different sorts of habitats, because it did range right through the deserts as well as in the wetter parts.
Less than 10 years ago, the chuditch, or western quoll, was so rare only 4,500 of them were left in the world. But a successful captive breeding program run at Perth Zoo has changed that.
Since 1991, when the breeding program started at the zoo, over 300 chuditch have been born and released back into the wild. And we've been able to set up populations at Julimar Forest, north of Perth, Lake Magenta in the middle of the wheat belt, Cape Arid east of Esperance, and Mount Lindsay in the southwest. So and Kalbarri up on the west coast. So there are 5 sites that we've been able to put chuditch into.
There are now around 10,000 living in WA, and our largest carnivorous marsupial may soon be taken off the endangered species list. But the chuditch, which is an Aboriginal name, still needs protection, especially from its major predator, the fox.
Foxes not only eat the young ones and probably the adults, but they also compete for the same sort of food. Foxes eat a large amount of large invertebrates like grasshoppers and cockroaches and things like that. They'll also eat the small mammals that the chuditch also eat, so there's competition for food.
The chuditch likes to roam around at night. It's nocturnal and survives for around 4 years on average in the wild. For the little quoll to survive, it must be able to live in safety, and that means maintaining a breeding program and protecting its natural bushland home from fire and land clearing.